In the heart of New York City, the G family was one of those households everyone knew, not just for their wealth but for the peculiar tradition that dictated their lives. Every family member's name started with a G, and with that came a cloud of mystery, as though fate itself watched over them with a curious hand. George, the son of Gideon and Glory, was not the brightest child, but he was theirs, and they loved him deeply. George was a quiet, introspective boy, an introvert who found solace in the silence. He often sat alone in their large home, watching his father move with determination and his mother glide with grace. The family was complete when baby Gladys arrived, a bundle of joy who stole all their hearts. Though George was 8 years old when Gladys was born, he couldn't help but feel a mix of wonder and isolation, especially as he struggled with things that seemed easy for others. The G family's joyous evening. One evening, Gideon received great news from Glory, who announced that Gladys had finally started to crawl. It was an emotional milestone for the family, and in celebration, Gideon decided to take them all out for dinner at one of New York's finest restaurants. The chandelier lights sparkled over their heads as they sat around a grand dining table, the city's hustle fading behind the luxury of the evening. Gideon was the first to speak. "Did you see her? Our little Gladys, crawling so confidently. She's going to be walking soon." Glory beamed. "It reminds me of when George was little," she said softly, glancing at her son, who was quietly picking at his food. George's chest tightened. He remembered. It wasn't the proud, celebratory memory that everyone had for Gladys. He had taken longer, much longer, than most children to crawl. He had been so still, so distant, that his parents grew worried. "Do you remember, George?" Gideon asked kindly, though George could hear the faint note of nostalgia in his father's voice. His mother chuckled gently. "You were our little puzzle. We prayed so hard, fasted even. Your father and I spent days in the field, kneeling, walking, even running, pleading to God. We wanted nothing more than for you to crawl." George sat silently, staring down at his plate. He could still recall those days vividly. He'd sit on the porch, his chubby little hands resting on his legs, watching his parents as they performed their strange, hopeful rituals. Sometimes they'd kneel, bending low, their hands clasped together, eyes turned towards the heavens. Other times they'd pace the field behind their house, almost like a dance, in perfect rhythm, knees bent, swiveling like a fan, their faces lifted towards the sky as though waiting for an answer. He remembered feeling stuck, trapped. He watched the grass sway, the birds fly, his parents run freely. Yet he remained still, wishing, hoping one day he too could move like them. Then one day it happened. George's triumph. The family had been sitting in the living room when George suddenly appeared in the doorway, crawling out from the bedroom. His eyes were shining, and his face held a triumphant smile that his parents would never forget. There he was, their little boy, crawling at last, as though he had been waiting for the perfect moment to show them what he was capable of. Glory gasped, and Gideon shouted with joy. "He's doing it! He's finally doing it!" George grinned as they clapped and cheered. He had finally found his freedom, even if it had taken longer than expected. The struggles at school. But the world didn't slow down for George, not in the way he wished it would. At Mayfair Academy, a prestigious school that his father insisted he attend, George was constantly outpaced by his peers. While other children grasped concepts quickly, George was left fumbling in the dark, unable to piece things together as easily. The worst came in Base 4, when his teacher asked him to read aloud from a textbook in class. George stood before his classmates, his hands trembling, his face flushed. He stared at the page, the words swirling, refusing to form coherent sentences in his mind. His voice quivered as he struggled to pronounce each word, but nothing came out right. Laughter echoed in the classroom. The other children snickered, whispering cruel remarks that pierced George's fragile heart. He was humiliated. It was as if the ground had opened beneath him, swallowing every ounce of dignity he had left. That evening, he locked himself in his room, tears streaming down his face. His parents had tried their best to comfort him, but deep down, George knew something had to change. He couldn't go on like this, not with the weight of his family's expectations and the cruelty of the outside world pressing down on him. A new beginning. Determined to turn things around, George put it upon himself to improve. He asked his parents for help, and they spared no effort. His father, a successful businessman, hired